radical left has taken over the Democratic Party.
Hello and welcome to Think Progressively, covering politics and all the other chaos life has to offer. This is episode 15, recorded on Wednesday, November 25th from Milwaukee. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jason.
And you officially just had Thanksgiving. Jason, how was it?
It would be good, I think. I feel like we're doing the Aqua Teen Hunger Force robot turkey thing.
Just poorly. Just not as well done.
I didn't much care for that episode, honestly, anyway. So
you don't want a well-done turkey.
No goblocks allowed here.
And on today's episode, we discuss the history of redlining in a new study relating the health effects of redlining to today. But first, the headlines.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake, disgusting news.
Up first in headlines, Emily Murphy at the GSA finally did her job and allowed the Biden campaign to transition to the White House.
So they finally released the funds and are allowing his team to take meetings and things like that.
Well, and get more access to information and put teams in place and get ready for things like that, which should have been done weeks ago already.
And traditionally would have been.
Trump was very calm through all this. He did tweet afterwards from the news. I want to thank Emily Murphy at GSA for her steadfast dedication and loyalty to our country. She has been harassed, threatened, and abused. I don't know if abuse is the correct term to use there. And I do not want to see this happen to her, her family, or employees of GSA. Our case strongly, all caps, continues. We will keep up the good, quote unquote, fight. And I believe we will prevail. Nevertheless, in the best interest of our country, I am recommending that Emily and her team do what needs to be done with regard to initial protocols and have told my team to do the same.
Who do you think wrote that?
Not him. Because then also right after that, he tweeted saying that he'll never concede because of all the illegal ballots and dead people voting.
Speaking of dead people, more Trump administration officials have tested positive for COVID.
Including
Donnie Jr.
Woo! Is it bad to be
happy? Can you
happy?
snort COVID? You think maybe that's how he got it?
No, he got it when his girlfriend just started screaming at him.
Yeah, she did have it earlier in the year, right?
She did.
How did everyone around her not instantly get it?
And on top of that, Ben Carson also tested positive for COVID.
Human sloth Ben Carson.
I mean, what more do we need to even say at this point? We have a bunch of incompetent boobs who are running our country. What do you expect?
And COVID makes you lethargic, right? Ben Carson's going to go into a coma for sure.
He'll never wake up again. Oh, that's actually just death.
So yesterday, we had a press conference from the incoming Biden administration where they announced some new cabinet nominees.
We did.
Not very happy about these, but pretty much what we should have expected from a Biden administration. It's very much a bunch of people that were in the Obama administration.
And I don't know if we should go through these more in depth in a later episode. We don't have time to do it today, but I think it'd be a good idea to do some deep dives into some of these people.
We can just quickly go down the list. For Secretary of State, we have Antony Blinken, who was the former Deputy Secretary of State. Climate Czar is a familiar face, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry.
John Kerry, woo!
I'm kind of mixed.
My boy's back.
I mean, I don't remember him really being a climate person or caring much about the environment previously, but I've heard from people that have worked with him that is a big focus these days.
It became a big focus of him after he left Congress. I know he did several testimonies to climate change, bringing studies to, I think, different House committees, things like that as well. So it became much more involved in his life after.
He was working at U.S. Bank after, so I don't know how much of a focus it was. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, but on the face of it, it's not too exciting for me. But I've heard from people that are more progressive that have said that they like the appointment, so I guess we'll see on that one.
It could be a lot worse. Let's put it that way.
Next, we have Alejandro Mayorkas as Homeland Security Secretary. He will be the first foreign-born Homeland Security Secretary. That's kind of a good stick in the eye.
First Latino Homeland Security Director.
Yeah, that'll be a good stick in the eye to all the racist build the wall people. So I kind of like that part of it.
Yep, me too.
Linda Thomas Greenfield, ambassador to the United Nations, another career politician, but again, kind of what we expect. Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary. I believe she is the first female Treasury Secretary. Pretty much, as I said, all of these picks are not terribly exciting for me. There is some diversity there, which is nice, but I'd like to see some diversity of opinion from the people that have had those positions before.
These
not
are all
just
Washington veterans, right? These are nothing new, nothing crazy. And actually, I think that's kind of a big point, too, where, again, this is what you expected out of Biden, especially coming from such an incompetent administration before him with Trump's. He wanted to put people in who can get in right away and know what to do. So he didn't want to really bother with trying to train people who were new to this type of role. And I can respect that to some point. Again, even though I don't really have a great admiration for some of these people, but it could be a lot worse. I'm just happy to have competent people back in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good demonstration of why I didn't vote for Biden in the primary and why he wasn't even like in my top 5. But this is what we expected. This shows that, again, Republicans were lying this entire time, and they still continue to lie about Biden being this radical socialist who's just going to get bullied by the left wing of the party. I have yet to see it.
Same here. But I still see people calling Biden a communist.
Yeah, that's not going to stop.
No. And so you just have to keep telling your relatives that you're not happy with Biden either, and then you'll be happier. At least shut them up for about a few minutes.
Yeah, it was called Settle for Biden, not Be Excited for Biden. So let's move on to the breaking news story.
The Giuliani hearing, kind of.
There was a Republican hearing in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania today about election irregularities hosted by the Pennsylvania GOP state senators.
This was amazing.
This is the day after Pennsylvania was certified for Biden. Trump was supposed to attend until, surprise, surprise, one of his campaign advisors, Boris Epstein, tested positive for COVID. So instead of being there in person, he called on the phone. And
they literally just held his phone to the microphone.
Yep, they put the phone on speakerphone and held it up to the microphone. It was ridiculous. And all he did was spout the same nonsense that's been debunked. We talked about everything here.
The election was rigged. Dead people were voting. People were getting ballots sent to them left and right. People were supposedly voting without even knowing it.
The Dominion software glitch, and now that's like a Hugo Chavez conspiracy. That's gotten crazy.
Che Guevara.
Che Guevara. Yeah, it's just nonsense. And there's really nothing, I mean, there's nothing substantive that he said. And it's all just repeating the same stuff that they've been saying this whole time, as if it's like something that's going to actually overturn the election.
What really scared me was, yes, Trump ranted like a lunatic, like we have been talking about for the last, several years now, at least not on the podcast, but you get my point. What still scared me over anything else that he said was the fact that you just saw people just cheering and clapping as he said this crazy nonsense. In the hearing, they were applauding it in the hearing. And that's what scares me, because this stuff is really going to stay. I don't believe these people are just faking it. I'm sure some of them are, but I truly believe that this stuff has a lasting impact.
Yeah, the Trump fans are not going anywhere.
And when you have a large amount of people who are still in power, who are not going to concede to an election or just say every time they lose, it's going to be a rigged election, what's going to happen? Is that just how things are going to work now?
If you win, it was fair. If you lose, it was fraud.
I know, it still scares me. Good news is, at least with this, it's almost over.
Yeah, these are the same things that they supposedly brought up in court, although every time they go to court, because you can't actually lie.
Right, they get shut down. In
federal court. Well, they don't even present this stuff.
Nope.
If you look at the court hearings and that they've gone through, they'd say, well, we're not saying it's fraud. We're just saying we've got these affidavits from people and we just want somebody to look into it. And they're being told they've lost something like 30 court cases now.
Yep.
And they're being told by these judges, that's not evidence. That's not how any of this works. You look at the affidavits, they're just from people that don't understand the process because they've never been involved before, and they don't understand how things work, and everything confuses them, and they say that that's election fraud because they don't know what they're doing. And that's why they've lost every one of these cases.
Did you see that they asked for another recount after the recount in Georgia?
No, I did not see that.
Yeah, they asked for a third recount because they thought that the second recount wasn't good enough. And I think Trump even said, well, of course the recount went for Biden again because they counted all the illegal ballots again. If they counted only the legal ones, then I would have won. So let's do it again for a third time. I think they actually requested a third recount formally and say, this time, let's count only the legal ballots.
Only the ones that have the dot filled out next to my name. Those are the legal ones.
But also, I remember seeing on Twitter the other day, and I responded to Trump on this as well, that he's saying in Wisconsin, you have to be physically permanently confined before you can request an absentee ballot. Did you see that?
I did not. I know that that's not true.
Right.
So I don't know if he's getting confused there. Someone on his team is confused with that. I don't know.
I have no idea. But again, this is so easily fact checkable, and our president doesn't do it. I voted absentee, and he's telling me that I didn't actually vote absentee.
Yeah, me too.
God, they're so stupid.
Speaking of so stupid,
we are just nailing these segues.
We have some listener feedback. This was actually posted a little bit more than a week ago. I didn't see it.
We got our first bad review.
It's not the first. It's the first. Well, it's the first one that actually left a review. It's our second 1-star review. This one from Shillelagh. Sounds familiar. Good if you want a left-wing echo chamber. While they seem honest in their personal beliefs, their analysis on what motivates right-of-center people is preposterous. They see Republicans as evil. The podcast needs much more nuance or actual engagement with differing opinions.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. And yes, this is someone that we both know personally.
Oh my God. And there's just so much wrong.
The podcast titled Think Progressively
Is a
needs some
progressive
differing
podcast?
opinions.
Yeah. Well, what would you expect out of a podcast? This is what we're doing for an outlet. If you don't like it, that's fine, but you don't have to be.
We see Republicans as evil. I don't believe in evil. I believe in greed and self-interest.
I think they're wrong. I think they're ignorant about a lot of things. And even then, I would even say that all Republicans are wrong and evil about everything. That's so dumb. And I don't even understand the idea of, but their analysis of what motivates right-of-center people is preposterous. What is he even referring to?
Well, I have a solution. If having his own podcast and multiple Twitter accounts that he uses every day and hosting conventions, which he often speaks at, is not enough outlet for Brian, I suggest would like to send us email at thinkpropod@gmail.com. I will read his emails and we'll discuss them. So I'll give him his own segment. We'll call it Brian Damage. And we can talk about his ideas and give analysis.
His hot takes.
All he wants. And if we have any more listener feedback, any reviews, leave us a review on iTunes. Send us email. Let us know what you think.
Good or bad.
Maybe we'll make fun of you as well.
I like Brian Damage.
Left wing. We're going left wing all the way.
So I want to talk about this new study talking about the health effects of housing discrimination. Where do you want to start, Jason?
Well, why don't you tell us about the study?
Sam, that's a good place to start. Yeah, so this study was done by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition and the University of Richmond, Virginia, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Hey, local stuff. What they did was analyze historic redlining maps from 142 urban areas across the United States. They compared the maps to the current economic status and health outcomes in those neighborhoods today and found higher rates of poverty, shorter lifespans, higher rates of chronic disease, including asthma, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and kidney disease. Jason Richardson, a research director from the NCRC and a co-author of the study, said, "That's a startling revelation that this pandemic is going to have a more serious impact on communities that were redlined by official policy in the 1930s.
So what is redlining, you may ask?
Well, many of you may have heard the term redlining before, but for those of you who don't know where the term actually comes from, let's walk through it. The practice of redlining started in the 1930s after the worst of the Great Depression happened. The federal government, through the now defunct agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation,
or HOLC.
Yep. Created a series of color-coded security maps to identify areas with greater number of people who are more likely to default on mortgage. As you can probably guess, areas with higher populations of people of color were almost always deemed the riskiest neighborhoods.
They actually were always deemed the riskiest neighborhoods because they were one of the conditions for deeming a neighborhood risky.
Bingo. Those neighborhoods were then outlined and marked with red ink.
So, what is the history of this? How did we get to this point? This kind of all starts with
racism.
Well, yes, very much with racism. After the end of slavery, a lot of cities had racial zoning ordinances. So you had an area of the city where blacks were allowed to live, and other minorities as well, and areas where they were not allowed to live. This was outlawed in the 1917 Supreme Court case Buchanan versus Worley from Louisville, Kentucky, which deemed that racial zoning ordinances violated the 14th Amendment. This led to individual contracts called racial covenants, and these would be added to a bill of sale anytime you would sell a property or your house that would say, no one who is black is allowed to live here or occupy the space except for servants, or specifically say only people who are white or Caucasian or of the Aryan race, because you remember previous to Germany, the United States was kind of the big proponent of eugenics and the Aryan race theory. So these racial restriction covenants were in use all the way through the 1850s, but they became popular once the racial zoning ordinances were not allowed, and particularly they became popular after the 1926 Supreme Court case, Corrigan v. Buckley, which was in Washington, D.C., and upheld the use of racially restrictive covenants, saying that they did not violate the 14th Amendment. After 1926, those racial covenants really spread across the country, and most new developments had some kind of racially restrictive language. If you're in an older home, if you look through the history of your deed, you might very well find that there is racially restrictive language in place. I saw from the Black Holocaust Museum that's here in Milwaukee that they actually have an example of a racially restrictive covenant from South Milwaukee that is technically still in place until 2024. Now, these covenants were eventually overturned in the 1948 case Shelley v. Kramer. That made them legally unenforceable. So if you sold your house to someone who was restricted, they wouldn't be able to take the house from you, actually from them, which they could have previously. So not legally enforceable, but that language was not outlawed until we get all the way into the Fair Housing Act, which we'll talk about later. Why is this important? Because this established segregated neighborhoods. So if...
on the books.
Legally, this codified racism.
Yes. I think that's something we need to talk about as well, is that this was segregation that was happening by our government, and that was reinforced by our government. This isn't just racial or racist people acting in their own interest. This is actually our country treating black people as second-class citizens.
And don't get us wrong, this also applied to other races. A lot of times the language also included Asians, Mongolians for some reason. I think they just like the word. Mexicans, basically anybody who wasn't second-generation European. Because they didn't also like people that were foreign-born either. But in 100% of the cases, the language excluded people of African descent. Whereas the other races, sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't. But 100% of the time, these were specifically aimed at keeping black people out of neighborhoods. That kind of takes us to the Federal Home Loan Bank Act of 1932. Now, keep in mind, this is at the very end of the Great Depression. Millions of people have lost their homes, have nothing. So in order to try to rebound from that, President Herbert Hoover passed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act in order to lower the cost of home ownership. It established the Federal Home Loan Bank Board to charter and supervise federal savings and loan institutions. It created the Federal Home Loan Banks, which lend to building and loan associations, cooperative banks, homestead associations, insurance companies, savings banks, community development financial institutions, and insured depository institutions in order to finance home mortgages. So they gave money to the banks in order to provide low-interest loans, and they insured those mortgages. So between 1933 and 1936, the HOLC, which we talked about before, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, made a bunch of new low-interest mortgages to 1 million homeowners who were in default or had already lost their homes. So this is post-Great Depression. This is how a lot of our parents and grandparents were able to buy a home. This was government welfare.
I say, yeah, with these federal programs.
Right. So, no bootstrapping here.
Because the mighty socialist Herbert Hoover.
And this would have been also around the New Deal era.
Yes.
and FDR. So the Federal Home Loan Bank Board used the HOLC staff, along with local realtors and lenders, to assess loan risk in 239 cities in 1935. That's where the creation of these security maps came from. So this is, again, a federal government institution creating these maps, which graded each neighborhood from 1 to 4, 1 being the most desirable, 4 being the least desirable. 4, and they were color-coded. 4 was red, 3 was yellow, 2 was blue, and 1 was green. In order to get a green rating, you had to, in most cases, your neighborhood had to have these racial covenants in place. That's the only way they would give you a green rating.
I believe there were stories, or there are plenty of stories of this stuff too, where you have the FHA, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or the HOLC, who are declining these higher ratings for people because they have like 2 to 3 black families in these neighborhoods.
Yes, it literally, if you look at the form that was there, and you can find these maps. I looked at the one for Milwaukee. My parents lived in a red line, and that's where they still live. The house I grew up in was in a red-lined neighborhood because there were too many foreign-born people in the area, and there were too many laborers. That's another thing. It's also very much divided by class.
Yes.
If you are a laborer, if you are a day worker, you're not desirable, and your neighborhood would get a lower rating.
And we'll talk a little bit about why that is too. We'll go into their rationale behind it.
So you had a situation where new neighborhoods were forming up because everybody was getting these home loans, and realtors and developers were buying up all this farmland in the outskirts of cities, turning it into housing tracts. And in order to get the best rating for those neighborhoods and to get the best mortgage price, because remember, these are banks that are behind this, and the government is insuring these loans. If you were in a redlined area, you couldn't get a mortgage. They would not insure your mortgage. And you had to go to other outside predatory lenders because you couldn't get the new low-interest loan from the government. So you had to go through alternative financial institutes, which generally would just rob you and take back the property anyway.
Imagine doing payday loans, but for a house.
Yes. And that still reverberates to this day, which is kind of the point of what we're talking about. So you had these new neighborhoods with low-interest mortgages that were only available basically to white people because they were the only ones that could move in there. And those were the only areas that could get the best loans. And that's basically the creation of the suburbs. So anybody that's living in a suburban house that was built in the 30s, you almost certainly have a racial covenant somewhere on the deed, and you're white. And that is, again, 239 cities. That's all across the country. You can find these maps online, these security maps, and look for yourself.
Now, I want to get into more of what the Federal Housing Administration did, because this all happened under the FHA. The Federal Housing Administration, if you guys don't know, is responsible for offering mortgage insurance to FHA approved lenders to give to specific people based on qualifications. Basically what Jason said. The FHA would basically help people find affordable mortgages so they don't have to get robbed by payday loan realtor insurance companies. So like Jason said before, with these qualifications for getting these different scores of risk assessment, I want to go into the actual FHA underwriting manual that I have from 1938 and talk about some of the things that they had for these risk assessment tools. This is a quote from the Quality of Neighboring Development section. Quote, areas surrounding a location are investigated to determine whether incompatible racial and social groups are present for the purpose of making a prediction regarding the probability of the location being invaded by such groups. That's horrendous and very explicit.
Yeah, there is a term infiltration that you'll see in all of these documents when you look up the assessments in each neighborhood on these security maps, where they will say the area is infiltrated by Polish and Italian, or infiltrated by Negroes.
Well, and they also use a lot in this manual the word incompatible, or the phrase incompatible racial group or segment or something like that, to distinguish between whites and non-whites, because they're supposedly incompatible with each other. So, for example, I have another one from the Quality and Accessibility of Schools section from that same 1938 manual. Quote, however, if the children of people living in such an area are compelled to attend a school where the majority or a considerable number of the pupils represent a far lower level of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. So not only did the racial component get touched on, what Jason talked about before, which were working class and lower class people, were also considered less valued. And a really good example of what Jason was talking about before, where the FHA were putting in these racial covenants in for new building projects, is actually Levittown, which is a suburb of New York City. See, back in 1947, Levitt and Sons Incorporated wanted to build 17,000 new homes for returning World War II veterans. They had nowhere near the capital necessary to build those houses on their own. So what the FHA did was guarantee bank loans for construction and development to Levittown on condition that no homes be sold to African Americans and that every home has a clause in its deed prohibiting resale to African Americans.
And these clauses stayed with the property forever.
Yes, exactly.
So it didn't matter if the first person who bought it sold it to somebody else. If anywhere down the line they sold it to anyone who was restricted on that deed, they would lose the property and it would go back to the original owner.
Our country cared more about the resale of houses to non-whites than they do about resale of guns to people on the black market.
And this was all about property values.
Oh, yes.
And this leads to another terrible housing practice called blockbusting.
Yep.
Where they would find a neighborhood where maybe one black family moved into, and realtors would go in and they would talk to the other people around there, and they would say, look, your area that you're in, this block, it's not racially restricted. All these black families are going to move in. It's going to lower your property values. Your home's not going to be worth anything. I tell you what I do just today for you. I'll buy your house. It'll be a little under market value, but it'll be way more than you're going to be able to get tomorrow once the next black family moves in. And they would sell. They would use fear. They would say, look, they're going to destroy your neighborhood and your home values are going to plummet. And they would basically con all of these people out of their homes for a reduced market value. They would sell them these new developments that were racially restricted, and then they would turn around and sell their home using these predatory lending practices that we talked about and these very horrible, like high interest rates and loans that would revert back to the seller if they defaulted, things like that, so that they couldn't build up equity to minority groups. And that created segregated neighborhoods.
Well, if you think that's bad, you had realtors who would literally go out and pay black people to go and walk around these neighborhoods. They would find impoverished black people. I think there was one story specifically about them finding black women and have them walk around with strollers and just say that there are more black families coming into your home to scare these people.
Coming into your neighborhood.
Right. So they're literally hiring black people to scare white people, which is disgusting.
And that's where we get the term white flight.
Right. Then you have Robert Nelson, who oversees the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality Project, said in a recent CBS article, which we'll link in the show below, the federal government at the time called this best practices for responsible lending.
And that is where you can find these security maps, by the way,
Yes.
which we'll link to.
So obviously for those people who were in those red line neighborhoods, it was incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to obtain a home loan or to refinance their home in any way, shape, or form.
And not only are they not able to access these low interest mortgages to get a nice house out in the suburbs like everyone else is doing at this time, they can't even buy the homes in the neighborhoods they're allowed to live in because they can't get a mortgage for it. So they're kind of subjected to only renting and never owning a home, and then being in a racially segregated neighborhood. And then on top of that, what happened once most of the white upper class people moved to the suburbs? Another government program built highways so that they could still have access to the city to get to their jobs. And they built those highways right through the predominantly black neighborhoods, devaluing them further.
Well, and we don't even have time to talk about the fact that they intentionally put in or more industrial and manufacturing factories into these types of neighborhoods just to decrease those values.
And it also meant that businesses were moving out to the suburbs, which led to the people in the urban areas having less access to a lot of the goods and services that are available to everyone else.
Well, and then dealing with a lot more health issues because you had to deal with more things like pollution and contamination and things like that too.
Yeah, because you had more of the heavy industry staying in those urban city areas.
We're not just saying, they were encouraged to go to those areas by our government. Then in the 1960s, sociologist John McKnight coined the term redlining to define the discriminatory lending practice. And that's where we actually get the term as we know it today.
And here in Milwaukee, something I did not know, for 200 consecutive days from August 1967 to March of 1968, you had Father James Groppe and the NCAA Youth Council organizing protests and marches against racial discrimination in housing across the city. I had never heard of this, and apparently this was national news at the time. It only ended when the Fair Housing Act was passed, which we're up to basically right now. I just before we started recording this, actually called my mom on the phone because she would have been a teenager around this time and asked her if she remembered anything about this. And at first, she really didn't remember. And then I mentioned that Father Groppe, and then that kind of rang the bell. And she said, yeah, I do remember. I remember that was a big deal. I remember that name. And she wasn't in the areas that this really affected, which was they were marching from the downtown area, which was predominantly African-American and still is to this day, to the south side of Milwaukee, which was predominantly Polish, which my mom is Polish, but they lived more on the north side. So it wasn't, she wasn't right in that area, but she does remember them. She did remember that it was about fair housing. She said that she remembers the protests being peaceful, though I did look it up, and there was some violence. There was some rioting at one point in the downtown area. I'm sure at the time people, maybe that use Shillelagh as their screen name might have been saying something like, these are all a bunch of thugs that are looting and rioting, and they need to be stopped. But, what's
the 1960s equivalent of referring to Martin Luther King?
I think it was Martin Luther King. Because this is the era that he was also leading civil rights protests. But it's interesting to know that we had a local connection there, that there was a lot of housing discrimination. And to this day, and that's the thing, it didn't fix anything, because to this day, Milwaukee is known as one of the most segregated cities in America and one of the worst places to live if you're black. And I don't know how to fix that. I wish I did. But that just shows that, everyone always talks about, well, racism is over now. There's no such thing. Someone named Brian once told me that racism was a thing of the past and that there's no such thing as institutionalized racism. And I don't understand how anyone can say that.
Well, we're also talking about going up against a century of segregation, right? Like, this stuff doesn't get fixed. willy-nilly. And to be honest, when you said that you don't know how to fix this, I don't either, because I don't know how to go against generations of problems and segregation and racism.
And one of the things that was done in 1968, we did have the Fair Housing Act. It declared these types of discriminatory practices illegal. It did end the racial covenants. It declared those unconstitutional to even have on, not just not legally enforceable, but they weren't allowed to be on contracts anymore.
And then racial inequality was over.
All fixed.
We entered a new age.
So that did prevent some of the damage that was being done. There were still, and there still are to this day, housing discrimination issues. And there are still complaints of housing discrimination to this day, too many for the institutions that do exist to investigate.
I think that's one thing we need to talk about when it comes to addressing supposed skeptics or naysayers of racism or redlining or institutional racism, is we need to have them understand the idea or concept of lasting damage. Because, correct, once the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, it did help prevent future damage, which is great. I'm glad we did it, obviously. But the damage was still done. We still had racially segregated neighborhoods. That didn't undo all of that. And when people talk about reparations, it's because there was lasting damage that was done to these communities that was basically either completely hindering them, if not outright destroying them.
Yeah, you mentioned Levittown earlier.
Right.
Why don't we talk about what that looks like today?
So I have a good quote from Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law, which I highly recommend reading if you haven't already. And that talks a little bit about redlining and discrimination and our entire history, how we got to this point. And he said in an NPR interview about Levittown, those homes sold in Levittown for about $8,000 apiece, or $100,000, more or less in today's currency. African Americans, working class families could have bought those homes without those restrictions on those deeds, like Jason talked about before. Today, though, those homes sell for about $300,000 to $400,000. They're no longer affordable to working class families. In the ensuing 2 generations, the white families moved into those homes and gained that $200,000 to $300,000 in equity appreciation that black families didn't have. And he's right on the money there. The idea that a lot of someone's personal equity or personal wealth comes in their ownership of property. Well, when black people couldn't own property or other minority groups couldn't own property, they're falling farther and farther behind. So the idea that when the 1968 Fair Housing Act fixed anything, it's complete preposterous because the damage was already done. Minority communities were already lagging behind because they couldn't afford the equity that was happening at that moment.
A lot of those people used that equity that they built up in their homes to send their kids to college.
Exactly.
And that was not available to the minority groups that could not get those homes and those loans. We have a huge racial wealth gap to this day, and a lot of it is due to that equity that was built up. And again, these were not white people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps post-Great Depression. They were given government handouts.
Yeah, they were taking advantage of social programs, which, shocker, helped the people.
That's what built the middle class back up in this country.
So where are we today, then? Obviously, like Jason said, we have a major problem with homeownership disparities in the United States. According to Dr. Zhang Wenche, a research associate at the Urban Institute, she said, quote, "Since the Great Recession, the gap between the black and white homeownership rates in the United States has increased to its highest level in 50 years, from 28.1 percentage points in 2010 to 30.1 percentage points in 2017. That 30.1 percentage point gap is wider than it was when race-based discrimination was legal against black and brown homebuyers."
And the government needs to step in and do something. They created the problem in the first place, and now, you get all these IDW dorks and libertarians. They're like, oh, the government has no role in fixing social problems.
Well, you literally see them saying, we can't want the black community to be successful more than the black community does. I think Don Jr. just said that, 2 or 3 weeks ago?
That was the haunted porcelain doll that's married to Ivanka.
Of course. But the gap is getting worse. As of right now, we're still dealing with a large wealth gap, like Jason said, between black and white households. As of 2017, the median white household income was $61,363. The median black household income in 2017 was $38,183. For most of the time, there is a 60% gap between minority and white households in this country.
And also, during the housing crisis in 2008, most of the wealth that was lost belonged to minorities because they were first-time home buyers that had all of these predatory loans that caused the housing crisis in the first place.
Yep.
So all that did was make this gap worse, and probably is what leads to a lot of these studies, being in 2010, 2017, with this gap widening. A lot of that was probably due to the housing bubble, and we're still seeing it today with COVID.
So that brings us back to this study. So these are some of the key findings that they list from the study, according to the NCRC at least. Number 1, greater historic redlining is related to current neighborhood characteristics, including increased minority presence, higher prevalence of poverty, and greater social vulnerability. Number 2, there are statistically significant associations between greater redlining and general indicators of population health, including increased prevalence of poor mental health and lower life expectancy at birth. Number 3, there are statistically significant associations between greater redlining and pre-existing conditions for heightened risk of morbidity in COVID-19 patients like asthma, COPD, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, kidney disease, obesity, and stroke. And number 4, differences in life expectancy vary greatly among cities from 14.7 years less in redline neighborhoods of Rochester, Minnesota, to a 1.3-year greater life expectancy in redline neighborhoods of Ogden, Utah, which has experienced considerable growth and urban development since 1940. Diving deeper into that, Black and Latino residents are 3 times more likely to be infected and 2 times as likely to die from COVID compared to whites. As far as cases per 10,000 people, you're looking at white people with 23, Black people with 62, and Latino people with 73, which is a 60% increase. Results from the study include, on average, census tracts included in this analysis where approximately 46.6% minority populations had 21% living in poverty, which is an astronomical amount. The average prevalence of poor mental health also increased from 12.7% to 16.1% in low historic redlining areas compared to high historic redlining areas.
And on an even more historic note, we talk about COVID and its effect on populations. We know specifically here in Wisconsin, the Native American population is very, very hardly hit with COVID. And we didn't even get into the Homestead Act and all of that, but that's where literally their land was stolen from them and given for free to white settlers after the Civil War. But that also plays a factor into all of this. And again, a government institutionalized racism leading to current day poor outcomes for minorities.
And you can look even further into the health outcomes of these areas where you have, especially even in Milwaukee, there was a study done about the infant mortality rates of Black women compared to white women. So according to the study, the U.S. 2020 benchmark for infant mortality is 6 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. However, in 2015 in Wisconsin, there was a large disparity in infant mortality between African Americans with 14.5 infant deaths to 4.7 for white people or white women, which is huge. That's over 3 times.
And a lot of that is due to the health issues that we talked about. The predominantly Black communities that have historically been there since redlining and since housing segregation began, they're usually in food deserts because grocery stores don't find it profitable to build in those neighborhoods.
I don't know if you saw this, but the dietitian I think it was like the head dietitian for the Milwaukee public school system started doing a video series about how to eat healthily because there were so many issues with so many students living at home were not getting the nutrition they needed if they weren't going to school like in person. Like it's a big issue.
And how many people do you know that complain when these school programs that give kids breakfast and things like that? I remember that was huge.
Oh, it still is.
Yeah, people complain, why do they Look, these are people that are incredibly disadvantaged. That literally the most healthy meal they get every day is their school lunch. And they're always, have a hard time paying attention in class because they're super hungry when they get there. Lunch is usually near the end of the day. and we want to give them breakfast so that they can eat something right away in the morning and be able to pay attention more and be more contented and be healthier. You get people that, again, the libertarian crowd, the government shouldn't be paying for this. Yes, we should.
We need to invest in our communities. If we don't invest in it, nothing will happen. It will just continue to get worse and worse and worse. And the fact that people don't understand this drives me insane.
And that also brings up something that we haven't mentioned, but I think is really important. When we're talking about these communities that have incredibly lower property values, what does that mean? It means they pay less in property taxes, which is the main funding for schools in the area. So you know how in the rich suburbs, the schools are really nice, and then in the inner city, the schools are generally underfunded and less successful? Well, that's why. That all comes down to this same issue of redlining and housing discrimination, and it needs the government to fix it.
So what do we do? Well, the study has a couple of key recommendations to help us. Number one, it says to reform the Affirmatively Fair Housing, or the AFFH rule, that President Trump and Secretary of Housing Ben Carson, who now has COVID, by the way, have already canceled. This rule encouraged communities to identify and reduce concentrated areas of poverty.
So since we're talking about Trump, I wanted to include some Trump quotes that are relative to what we're talking about here, and maybe shows how he feels about this situation of housing inequality. So from his Twitter account, because that's how he communicates, Trump claimed that the rollback of the AFFH means suburbanites will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. That's what he said. The AFFH does not actually say anything about building low-income housing in the suburbs. So he is using fear of low-income, undesirable people moving into these neighborhoods in order to stoke fear and racism.
Well, and you saw that in the RNC, too.
Well, I'm just saying, it goes right back to what we were talking about before with blockbusting and white flight. He's using the same tactics.
The exact same tactics, which is kind of scary, the fact that when you think that racism is done, when you look back at our history and see the absolute parallels between what the Trump administration and what a lot of these same people are saying compared to what people said back in the 1960s, it's scary.
He knows, and this was Trump's dad was a housing developer back in this era. So, and he's been sued for housing discrimination.
Yep.
So our president literally, and his family certainly, contributed to everything that we're talking about now.
Moving forward, the study also recommends support for inclusionary zoning that adds affordable housing choices outside of the red line sections of the city and promotes the reduction of concentrated areas of poverty. Number 3 also goes to expanding the Community Reinvestment Act, or the CRA, to include non-banks and to modernize how this law is implemented. And then finally, number 4, it says to encourage locally relevant solutions such as expanded Section 8 and rent-controlled/vouchers and protect public housing, which is exactly Jason just said Trump was afraid of.
It's going to be hell for suburbia, is also a quote. I say, same thing with granting amnesty to all undocumented immigrants. If it was good enough for our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, it should be good enough for everyone else now. We should have another Federal Home Loan Act. Let's give out a ton of low-interest mortgages to minority first-time home buyers. Let's let them actually build equity in their homes. Just like what happened post-Great Depression and post-World War II for white people.
For further reading and more research for yourself, again, I highly recommend reading the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's a great deep dive into redlining and segregation and housing disparities. It's fantastic. I also recommend looking at any interviews he may have done. I'll try to link the NPR interview as well as his book. Take a look at this study by the NCRC and the University of Richmond and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. These are all really cool interactive maps that you can look at. They have a lot of great analysis and data that you can browse through. I highly recommend it. Also, take a look at the Milwaukee one for the infant mortality rates. This is going to be a very heavily linked episode with a lot of information in it. So seriously, look into all this stuff. There's a lot to go into. And as much as I want to avoid the term, a lot of rabbit holes that you can go into to make sure that you keep learning about this stuff, because it is relevant and it is very important to learn about this. So you don't have some douchebag, idiotic opinion that prevents black people from actually getting the housing that they need.
I would also recommend, I know we have a lot of listeners in southeastern Wisconsin, when we're able to again, hopefully next year, take a trip to the American Black Holocaust Museum.
Yeah, I second that.
There is a good WUWM segment where they talk to the head griot, which I did not know was a word until now, Reggie Jackson. And they talk about redlining and the history, and they have the security map from Milwaukee there. I would recommend going to that museum as soon as you're able. They've got a new building. I'm sure it'll be quite nice.
So look more into this, read more, get a bunch of books, and make sure that you keep your government honest about actually doing something and don't let them sit on their hands. Because if we don't, we're going to have more wealth disparities grow. We're going to have a worse housing crisis than we ever did before. And we're going to see racial disparities like you haven't seen because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Like you've never seen before.
Yep. Thank you for listening. We hope to see you in the next episode. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at ThinkProPod. You can email us at thinkpropod@gmail.com. And remember, when in doubt, think progressively. That's a startling revelation. Let me try. That's a startling revelation. Oh my God, I can't say revelation. Oh, just read my stuff. It'd be so much easier. Since the Great Recession, the gap between the black and white homeownership rates, since the Great Recession between just read it. It'd be so much easier. Again, I highly recommend reading the book, The Color of Raw. Why am I recommending reading when I can't myself?
It's a 3-letter word.
And I got one of them wrong. I got 30% of the word wrong.